Her father's hand did not shake when he signed her away. The study at Thornbury House smelled of tallow and stale tobacco, and the candle on the desk had burned to a stub by the time Gerald Hartley scratched his name across the bottom of the marriage contract. Susan stood 3 feet behind his chair, close enough to read every line. £3,000, her hand in marriage to Arthur Crewe, the Duke of Ravenfield. Payable upon completion of the ceremony. She was 19 years old, and she had just been sold to a man she had never met, a man the county called the Blind Duke, a man who had not left his estate in 2 years. Gerald set the quill down and pushed the contract across the desk to the solicitor. He did not turn around. "You should thank me," he said. "You will be a duchess." Most girls would weep with gratitude. Susan said nothing. There was no point. She had watched the creditors circle this house for 3 years. She had opened the door to them, poured their tea, read them her father's excuses while he hid in his study with a bottle and a deck of cards. She had watched him gamble away her mother's jewellery, the silver, the horse, and finally the house itself. £12,000 in debts. £3,000 from the Duke's solicitor would not cover a quarter of it, but it would keep her father out of prison for another season, and that was all Gerald Hartley had ever cared to plan for. She was the last thing of value he owned. The solicitor gathered the papers and left. Gerald poured himself a drink. Susan walked upstairs to her room and sat on the edge of a bed that would belong to a creditor by Christmas. She pressed her hands together until her knuckles ached and let the feeling come. Not grief exactly. Something colder. The recognition that every person in her life who should have protected her had failed, and that she was now entirely alone. She did not cry. She had work to do. Susan Hartley had spent 6 years as her father's unpaid clerk. From the age of 13, she had organised the magistrate's files, copied depositions, indexed case records, and filed every report that crossed Gerald Hartley's desk. She had done it because no one else would, because her father's hands shook too badly by afternoon to hold a pen, and because she had discovered, somewhere between the land disputes and the assault charges, that she had a memory like a steel trap. She could recall the exact wording of documents she had read once. Signatures, dates, phrasings, ink patterns. She could spot a forged hand from across a desk. She could recite a lease agreement verbatim 3 months after filing it. None of this mattered to her father. To him, she was furniture that could write. But one file mattered more than any other. 2 years ago, a sealed case had come across the magistrate's desk. The death of Edmund Crewe, younger brother of the Duke of Ravenfield, killed at a dawn duel at Ravenfield Meadow. Susan had been the one to copy the report before her father sealed it. She remembered every word. 12 paces, east-facing, Mr. James Whitlock standing opposite. But the shot that killed Edmund Crewe had not come from Whitlock's pistol. The powder burns on Edmund's coat were inconsistent with a range of 12 paces. The angle of entry was 30 degrees off the line of the duel. The shot had come from the tree line, 40 yards to the east. Someone had fired from behind a tree. Her father had ruled it death by misadventure, sealed the case, and never spoken of it again. At the time, Susan had not understood why. Now, packing her single trunk the night before a black carriage was due to take her to Ravenfield, she understood perfectly. Whoever had pulled that trigger held her father's debts, and her father, as always, had chosen the path that cost him nothing and cost everyone else everything. The morning she left, Gerald was still asleep. A creditor had come to the door at 7, and Susan had handled him with the quiet efficiency she had practised her whole life. She gave him the date of the next payment, showed him to the door, and locked it behind her. Then she picked up her trunk and walked outside. The black carriage was waiting. The coachman did not speak. No one from the house came out to say goodbye. Susan climbed inside and closed the door. Thornbury disappeared behind the hedgerows in under a minute. She had lived there for 19 years, and the house let her go as easily as her father had. The road to Ravenfield Hall took 4 hours. Susan spent them watching the countryside change from the rolling farmland near Thornbury to the wilder, darker landscape of the northern county. The trees grew taller and closer together. The light shifted. By the time the carriage turned through a pair of iron gates and rolled up a long gravel drive, the sky had turned the colour of slate, and the air smelled of rain and cold stone. Ravenfield Hall was enormous and silent. It sat on a rise above a shallow river, 3 stories of grey limestone with tall, dark windows that reflected nothing. The grounds were immaculate. The hedges were trimmed to mathematical precision. Everything was maintained, controlled, and utterly still. A man in a dark coat stood at the front door. Mr. Holt, the steward, introduced himself with a bow so precise it felt architectural. Behind him, a young woman in a pressed apron curtsied quickly, her eyes wide and nervous. "Nell will attend you, Your Grace," Mr. Holt said. The title landed on Susan like a stone dropped from a height. Your Grace. She was not a duchess yet. She was a magistrate's daughter with 1 trunk and a father who had sold her for £3,000. She followed Nell through the entrance hall. The house was spotless, warm, and completely silent. No music, no voices, no laughter. The servants moved like people who had been trained not to make sound. Portraits lined the staircase. A young man's face recurred in several of them. Dark-haired, open-faced, smiling. Edmund Crewe. Susan recognised him from the case file and looked away. The drawing-room door was open. He was standing by the fireplace. She noticed the room first, the way the air changed at the threshold, the way the 2 footmen near the door had straightened an inch taller, the way Nell's breathing had gone shallow beside her. Then she saw him. Arthur Crewe, the Duke of Ravenfield, was tall and lean, dressed in dark wool that fit him like it had been cut that morning. His hair was black, pushed back from a face that was sharp and angular and utterly still. His eyes were open. They were dark, and they did not focus on anything. He held a cane in his right hand, planted on the floor like a third leg, and he did not turn when she entered. He tilted his head instead, listening. "Miss Hartley." His voice was low, clipped, and as warm as the limestone walls outside. "I trust the journey was tolerable." It was not a question. Susan curtsied to a man who could not see her curtsy. "It was, Your Grace." "The ceremony is at 3 o'clock. The vicar is waiting in the chapel. I see no reason to delay." He was already walking toward the door before she could answer, the cane tapping a steady rhythm on the stone floor. His navigation was flawless. He passed through the door frame without brushing either side, turned left down the corridor without hesitation, and did not look back. The wedding was brief and cold. The chapel at Ravenfield was small, stone-walled, and empty, except for Mr. Holt, Nell, the vicar, and an elderly woman in dark blue silk, who sat in the front pew with her hands folded and her eyes fixed on Susan, with a sharpness that had nothing to do with piety. "My aunt," Arthur said when Susan glanced toward her, "the Dowager Duchess, Lady Marguerite." Lady Marguerite did not smile. She studied Susan the way a jeweller studies a stone, looking for flaws or fire. Susan held her gaze and did not look away. The vicar spoke the words. Arthur recited his vows, facing slightly to the left of Susan's face, his eyes unfocused and distant. When the moment came for the ring, his hand found hers with a precision that stopped her breath. His fingers closed around hers, slid the ring into place, and released her in a single motion. Exact, unhesitating. And then his hand was at his side, and his gaze had drifted back to the middle distance, and Susan tucked the observation into the back of her mind, where she kept everything that did not add up. After the ceremony, Arthur walked her to the base of the east staircase. "You will have the east wing. I keep to the west. Mr. Holt will explain the household routine. Dinner is at 7. He turned away. At the doorway he stopped. His free hand pressed flat against the stone frame, knuckles white, and for one breath he stood there rigid, as though something had caught him mid-step. Then his hand dropped and he was gone, the cane tapping away down the corridor. Nell led Susan to her rooms. They were beautiful, recently aired, with fresh-cut flowers in a blue vase and a fire already burning. A writing desk sat beneath the window, stocked with ink, paper, and a brass pen. A shelf held 30 or 40 books arranged by height. "Is there anything you need, Your Grace?" Nell asked. Susan looked at the desk, the books, the flowers that someone had chosen carefully. "What happened to the Duke's eyes?" she asked. Nell glanced at the open door. Her voice dropped to almost nothing. "We don't speak of it, Your Grace." The door closed. Susan stood alone in a room that belonged to her by law, and felt like a stranger's dream. She was the Duchess of Ravenfield. The word sat in her mouth like something borrowed that she would eventually have to return. She sat on the edge of the bed and let her hands shake. Dinner that evening was as cold as the ceremony. The table was long enough for 12, and Arthur sat at one end and Susan sat at the other, and neither spoke more than was required for the passing of the salt. He ate with practised precision, never reaching for the wrong glass, never fumbling with the silverware, and Susan watched him across the candlelight and said nothing, and thought of the hand that had found hers at the altar, with a precision no blind man should have had. When the plates were cleared, Arthur retired to the west wing without a word. Susan sat alone at the empty table for a long time before she stood and went walking through the house, because the thought of sitting in her room on her wedding night, with nothing but silence and the sound of her own breathing, was worse than the thought of wandering a stranger's corridors in the dark. She found him in the library. She had come looking for a book, something to occupy her mind on this strange first evening, and she had not expected anyone. The room was dark except for the fire, and Arthur stood before it with his back to the door, holding a small frame portrait in both hands. His cane leaned against the mantel, abandoned. His shoulders were drawn tight, and his head was bowed, and his face, reflected in the glass of the portrait, was stripped of every mask he wore. The grief on his face was raw and unguarded and terrible, the kind of sorrow a person only shows when they believe they are completely alone. His lips were pressed tight, and his chin was drawn down, and Susan could see, even in the reflection, that his eyes were wet. She recognized the painted face in the frame. Dark hair, open smile, Edmund Crewe. The same face she had seen repeated on the staircase, the same face that had stared up at her from a magistrate's case file 2 years ago, and here it was held between the hands of the brother who had survived him. The floorboard beneath her foot creaked. Arthur's head came up. The mask was back before he turned, smooth and seamless as a door closing. He set the portrait face down on the mantel, and his hand lingered on it for just a moment before he let go. "Forgive me," he said. "I thought I was alone." "I can come back," Susan said. "No." He paused, and something in his voice shifted, as though he were pulling it back to level ground. "Stay. I have correspondence that needs reading." She stayed. He handed her a stack of estate letters, tenant complaints, and a boundary dispute between 2 farms on the northern edge of the Ravenfield holdings. She read them aloud in the steady, clear voice she had used in her father's study for 6 years, and when she reached the boundary dispute she stopped. "The surveyor's measurement is wrong," she said. "He has the eastern marker at 400 yards from the river, but the original deed of grant puts it at 360. I have read enough land leases to know the difference." Arthur was very still. "You have read land law, Your Grace." "My father is a magistrate. I have read everything in his study, every case file, every deposition, every lease, every sealed report." The words hung in the air. She had not planned to say the last part, but she did not take it back. Arthur said nothing for a long moment. Then carefully, "There is a Renshaw file in the 3rd drawer. Would you read that as well?" She read it, and the one after that. By the time the clock in the hall struck 10, she had read 6 documents and corrected 2 figures, and Arthur had stopped treating her like a patient come to nurse him. He was listening to her the way she had once listened to the barristers who came through her father's office, with the careful attention of a man who has recognized competence and is recalibrating everything he thought he knew. They were still reading when Mr. Holt appeared at the library door with a letter on a silver tray. His face had turned to stone. Arthur held the letter but did not open it, and his jaw tightened. "Lady Cordelia Vale," he said, "requests permission to visit Ravenfield." Susan watched his hand close around the paper. "Tell her no," Arthur said. Mr. Holt cleared his throat. "She writes that she holds a betrothal contract, Your Grace. She intends to challenge the marriage." The silence in the library was absolute. Arthur's sightless eyes faced the window. His knuckles were white again, the same white as the door frame after the ceremony. "Let her come, then." Mr. Holt withdrew. Arthur set the Cordelia letter on the mantel beside the face-down portrait of his brother, and said nothing more, and after a moment Susan understood that the reading was finished. She excused herself and went upstairs. In her room, she sat at the writing desk and tried to make sense of what she knew. A dead brother whose portrait he held in the dark, a sealed report in her father's office, a blind duke who navigated doorframes without touching them, and whose hand had found hers for the ring with the precision of a man threading a needle, a woman with a betrothal contract arriving to claim a man who had married Susan that very morning. She pressed her palms flat on the desk and felt the feeling she could not yet name. Not fear, not confusion, something closer to protectiveness, sharp and unexpected, for a man she barely knew who was carrying a weight she was only beginning to understand. A quarter of an hour later, Arthur's voice reached her from the corridor, low and directed at Mr. Holt. "Is the Foreign Office letter still in the lockbox?" "Yes, Your Grace." "Bring it to the drawing-room and ask my wife to attend me." The fire in the drawing-room had burned low by the time Susan arrived. Arthur sat in his usual chair, but the room felt different. A sealed letter lay on the table between them. The candlelight caught the red wax of an official seal. "Will you read this to me?" His voice was quieter than she had heard it, careful and measured, as if each word had been weighed before he released it. Susan took the letter from the table, broke the wax seal with her thumbnail, and unfolded it carefully against the edge of the desk. It was a Foreign Office dispatch addressed to His Grace the Duke of Ravenfield, marked confidential. It detailed the findings of a quiet investigation into the death of Edmund Crewe. It named Lady Cordelia Vale as a person of interest in the shooting. It referenced a magistrate's report, sealed by order of Gerald Hartley, that contained physical evidence inconsistent with the official ruling. It referenced her father by name. It referenced the debts her father owed to the Vale family. It laid out, in the flat, careful language of government correspondence, the possibility that Edmund Crewe had been murdered, and the investigation suppressed. Susan's hands went cold as she read, but her voice held steady because steadiness was the only thing she had ever been able to control, and she would not lose it now. She read every word. She did not skip a line or soften a phrase, because the letter did not soften anything either. When she finished, the room was silent except for the fire. Arthur set down his glass and looked at her, not the unfocused, drifting gaze she had watched since the ceremony that afternoon, not the careful approximation of blindness he wore like a second face. His eyes found hers with absolute precision, dark and clear and focused, and held them. Susan's breath stopped in her chest. "You can see," she whispered. "I have always been able to see." Susan did not move. The letter hung in her hand, and the room seemed to reshape itself around her, every surface suddenly unfamiliar, as though the walls and the fireplace and the chair he sat in had all shifted slightly while she was reading, and nothing was quite where she remembered it being. She thought of the wedding ceremony, his hand finding hers with that impossible precision for the ring. She thought of the library an hour ago, the portrait of Edmund set face down on the mantel, and the mask that had come back so smoothly when the floorboard creaked, as though grief were something he could fold and put away in under a second. She thought of dinner an hour ago, his eyes pointed at the far wall while she let her face do whatever it wanted, because she believed no one was watching, and all the time he had been watching. Every expression she had let slip across that long table. Every unguarded moment she had given away for free because she thought the man across from her could not see. Hours, only hours since the ceremony, and already she had given away more of herself than she had realized, because she had believed she was alone in her own face, and she had not been alone at all. The first feeling was shock, cold and physical, like stepping into a river that turned out to be deeper than it looked. The second was something closer to exposure, the raw, uncomfortable understanding that she had been seen without her knowledge, studied without her permission, and that every private look she had risked across the dinner table had landed on a pair of eyes that were wide open. The third feeling rose more slowly beneath the other two, and it was the one she could not push aside, because it was not about what he had done. It was a question. Why had he chosen her, of every woman in England, and what did he still need her to do? She set the letter on the table because her hands were no longer steady enough to hold it. Arthur did not move from his chair. He watched her stand there across the room from him, and he did not rush to fill the silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was plain and unhurried, the voice of a man who has rehearsed a truth for 2 years, and knows exactly how each word will land. 2 years ago, my brother Edmund stood 12 paces from James Whitlock at Ravenfield Meadow in a duel that should never have happened. The quarrel was mine. The position was mine. Edmund was there as my second. When the pistols fired, the shot that hit Edmund did not come from Whitlock's gun. It came from the tree line, 40 yards to the east. Edmund stepped in front of me. He took the ball that was meant for my chest. Arthur's voice did not waver, but his hands, resting on the arms of the chair, were gripping the wood hard enough to whiten, and Susan could see the tendons standing out beneath the skin. He died before the surgeon arrived. In my arms, on the grass. He was 22 years old. Susan thought of the portrait in the library, the painted smile, the dark hair. She thought of Arthur standing before the fireplace holding it, the grief on his face so raw it had made her look away. 22. Edmund had been 22, and Arthur had held him while he died on a meadow in the early morning light, and then he had closed his eyes and pretended to be blind for 2 years, so the woman who pulled the trigger would not run. The weight of that settled over her like something physical. Lady Cordelia Vale pulled the trigger, Arthur continued. The duel was supposedly fought over her honour, but there was no honour in it. She wanted Edmund dead, because he had discovered she was forging documents to claim control of the Ravenfield estate. She fired from behind a birch tree and let James Whitlock take the blame. "And my father sealed the report," Susan said. Her voice sounded distant to her own ears, as though it were coming from the far end of a long corridor. "Because the Vale family holds his debts." "Yes." "And you pretended to be blind. If Cordelia believes I cannot see, she believes I cannot identify her as the shooter. It has kept her circling instead of finishing what she started. She has spent 2 years scheming to marry me through a forged betrothal contract, rather than risk another killing, because a dead blind duke invites investigation, but a married one gives her everything she wants legally." Susan looked at the letter on the table between them, and then at the man in the chair who had been watching her with clear eyes all evening while she believed he could not see. She understood it now, all of it. The marriage contract her father had signed in his study was not a purchase, not really. It was a recruitment. Arthur Crewe had searched for the one person in England who had already read the sealed truth and who was desperate enough to accept a stranger's ring without asking questions. "You needed a wife," she said. "I needed a wife Cordelia could not legally displace, and I needed a wife who already knew what happened at Ravenfield Meadow, who had read the suppressed report, who could testify to its contents without needing the sealed original. There is only one person in England who fits that description. Yes." Susan's chest was tight and her pulse was hammering against her ribs, but she stood straight and did not look away from him. She could feel the shape of the next 2 years of her life rearranging itself around this conversation, the marriage she had thought was a cage turning into something else entirely, something far more dangerous and far more deliberate than she had imagined when she climbed into that black carriage at Thornbury. "My father sold me to pay his debts," she said, "and you bought me to catch a killer." Arthur held her gaze without flinching. "I bought your knowledge, but I should like to earn your trust." Neither of them spoke for a long time after that. The fire crackled and settled in the grate, and outside the drawing-room windows the Ravenfield grounds lay dark and quiet, under a sky that had no moon. Susan stood on one side of the room and Arthur sat on the other, and between them the letter lay open on the table like a bridge neither of them had yet decided to cross. The pretence was gone. What replaced it was not warmth, not yet, but something sharper and more honest, the dangerous clarity of two people who finally understood exactly where they stood and what it was going to cost them. "Lady Cordelia will come," Arthur said at last. "She has been circling this house for 2 years, and now that I have married, she will not wait much longer. When she arrives, she will believe I am blind, and that you are a fool your father sold cheaply. We will let her believe both. And then we will end this." Susan did not sleep that night. She lay in the dark of the east wing with the coverlet pulled to her chin and stared at the ceiling, and let the conversation replay itself from the beginning, every sentence, every shift in his voice, every detail she had missed, and every detail she had not. The house was silent around her. Somewhere in the west wing, Arthur Crewe was lying in his own bed with his eyes open, and for the first time she understood that the darkness he lived in was not the darkness of blindness, but the darkness of a man who had chosen to stop looking at the world so that the world would stop looking at him. In the morning, she came down to breakfast and found him already seated at the table. The cane was beside his chair. His eyes were pointed at the far wall. 2 footmen stood by the sideboard, and Mr. Holt poured the tea with his usual silent precision. The mask was back in place, seamless and complete, and Arthur reached for the toast with a slight fumble that Susan now recognized as choreography. She sat down across from him, and for the first time she understood the weight of what he carried every hour of every day. Not grief alone, though grief was the foundation, the exhaustion of performance, the loneliness of being watched constantly by people who believed they were watching a man who could not watch them back. She buttered her toast and said nothing, and Arthur said nothing, and between them the long table stretched out like a stage on which they were both now performing for an audience that did not know the play had changed. The weeks that followed reshaped the marriage at its foundation. During the day, the household moved to its usual rhythms. Arthur kept to his schedule, the cane tapping, the eyes unfocused, the servants orbiting at a respectful distance. Susan read him correspondence in the drawing-room each afternoon, and anyone listening at the door would have heard only the steady voice of a wife reading letters to a husband who could not read them himself. But in the evenings, after the staff had retired, and the last footman had banked the fire in the entrance hall and gone to bed, the drawing-room doors closed, and the performance ended. Arthur set the cane in the corner on the first evening, and did not touch it again until morning. He moved through the room without it, stepping around furniture with the easy certainty of a man who could see exactly where everything was. He poured his own wine. He pulled documents from the desk drawers himself and spread them across the table, and when Susan sat down beside him to read, he sat close enough that she could feel the warmth of his shoulder near hers, and he looked at the pages with her instead of staring at nothing. It was strange, those first evenings. Susan had grown accustomed to speaking to a man who appeared not to see her, and now she had to speak to one who was looking directly at her face, and the difference was larger than she had expected. She found herself losing her place in the documents when his eyes settled on her. She found herself aware of the angle of her jaw, the way her hair fell across her ear, the expression she made when she was concentrating. She had spent an entire evening believing she was invisible to him, and now she was not, and the adjustment was not unpleasant, but it was not comfortable either. It was like stepping out of a dark room into full sunlight and waiting for her eyes to stop watering. On the third evening, Arthur showed her the forged betrothal contract that Cordelia had sent to his solicitor the previous year. Susan held it under the candlelight and studied the handwriting, and recognition came almost immediately. "This is Cordelia's hand," she said, tracing the letters with her fingertip. The crossbar on the capital H, the way the tail of the Y curls back. I have seen this hand before, in letters she sent to my father about his debts. Arthur watched her trace the letters. "You are certain?" "I copied 3 years of my father's correspondence before I was 16, Your Grace. I know the shape of a signature the way a musician knows the shape of a chord. This was not written by you. It was written by a woman who practiced your name until she thought it looked close enough." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Arthur." She looked up from the contract. "My name is Arthur. We are past the point of Your Grace, I think." It was a small thing, a name offered across a desk covered in evidence, but it settled something between them that Susan had not realized was unsettled. She nodded and looked back down at the contract, and the room felt warmer than it had a moment before. Arthur called in Mr. Aldridge, his solicitor from London, a quiet man with wire spectacles and a leather case full of documents, who arrived on the Tuesday of the second week and stayed in the East guest room. They built the case piece by piece across the drawing-room table, and Susan was the spine of it. Her memory held the details that no document could provide, because the documents were sealed in her father's office, but the contents of those documents were stored in the same mind that had memorized every land lease and boundary survey in Thornbury County. The evenings grew longer. Susan began to notice small things about Arthur that the blind performance had hidden. The way he stood at the window some nights after they had finished working, not looking at the grounds but looking at the reflection of the room behind him, checking that the corridor was empty before he let the mask drop. The way he held his wineglass with both hands when he was thinking, turning it slowly in his palms. The way his eyes would settle on Edmund's portrait across the room and stay there for long minutes before he pulled them away. One evening in the 3rd week, they were reading through a set of Vale family financial records that Mr. Aldridge had obtained from the county registrar. The candle had burned down to a stub, and the fire was low, and they were sitting closer together than usual because the light was poor, and the handwriting on the ledger was small. Susan leaned forward to trace a line of figures with her finger, and her shoulder pressed against Arthur's arm, and neither of them moved. She could feel the warmth of him through the fabric of his coat, and her hand was inches from his on the edge of the ledger, and the numbers on the page in front of her stopped meaning anything for a moment, because the only thing she could think about was the fact that he had not pulled away. They stayed like that, reading a column of figures that neither of them was paying attention to, until the candle guttered and the room went dim. Arthur stood and lit a new one from the fire, and when he came back he sat a careful 6 inches further away, and Susan did not mention it, and they continued working. But something had shifted, and they both knew it. Lady Marguerite, who had said almost nothing since the wedding day, missed none of it. The Dowager Duchess occupied the east parlour most afternoons, embroidering with a precision that suggested the needle was an afterthought, and the real work was observation. She watched Arthur navigate rooms. She watched Susan read documents. She watched the way Arthur's head turned when Susan entered, the way his eyes tracked her across the room, and then snapped back to the middle distance when anyone else was present, and the expression on her face when she noticed this was not surprise, but quiet confirmation, as though she were checking a column of figures that had finally added up. One afternoon in the 4th week, Marguerite stopped Susan in the corridor outside the library. "You are not what I expected," the old woman said. "What did you expect, my lady?" "A mouse, Gerald Hartley's daughter, sold for pennies. I expected a girl who would sit in a corner and be grateful." Marguerite's eyes were sharp as flint. "Instead, I find a woman who reads land law and corrects surveyors, and has my nephew asking his steward what she looks like when she reads." Susan held her ground. "Is that a compliment?" Marguerite almost smiled. "It is an observation. I have been watching that boy for 2 years, and he has not been himself since Edmund died. This week, for the first time, I heard him laugh. It came from the drawing-room. You were reading him something." She turned and walked away before Susan could respond, her heels clicking sharply on the stone floor, and Susan stood alone in the corridor and realized that her hand had risen to her chest without her telling it to. Lady Cordelia Vale arrived on a Tuesday, in a carriage with gilt trim and a coachman in livery, accompanied by 2 ladies and a gentleman Susan did not recognize. She was beautiful in the way a blade is beautiful, with copper hair and green eyes and a smile that never quite reached past her teeth. She swept into Ravenfield as though she already owned it. At dinner that evening, 8 of the county's notable families had been invited at Cordelia's request. She sat at Arthur's right hand, close enough to touch, and she watched him with the careful attention of a woman testing a lock. She moved his wineglass 2 inches to the left. He reached for it in the wrong place, corrected, found it. She rearranged the candlesticks. She dropped her napkin near his foot and watched to see if he looked down. He did not. Then she turned her attention to Susan. "How charming," Cordelia said, her voice carrying the length of the table. "That his Grace has found a little clerk to manage his papers." She smiled at Susan across the silver. "Tell me, Your Grace, did your father include you in the sale price, or were you merely part of the furniture?" The table went silent. Lady Ashworth set down her fork. Colonel Dane fixed his eyes on his plate. Nell, standing by the sideboard, pressed her lips together so hard they went white. 8 families heard it. Every face turned to Susan. The heat rose in Susan's chest like a furnace door opening. Her hands were beneath the table, clenched in her lap, and no one could see them. She felt the word furniture land like a slap, and she absorbed it, held it, and let the silence do its work. "I am the Duchess of Ravenfield, Lady Cordelia." Susan's voice was level, unhurried, and carried without effort. "I manage nothing that is not mine by right." One line. The table exhaled. Lady Ashworth picked up her fork. Colonel Dane shifted in his chair, but the damage was done. By morning, every drawing-room in the county would know that the Duchess of Ravenfield was a debtor's daughter, sold like livestock to nurse a blind man. Later that night, in the privacy of her room, Susan locked the door and sat down on the floor with her back against the side of the bed and her knees drawn up, and let the composure crack. The shame came first. It was physical, heavy and hot, and it sat in her stomach like something she had swallowed that would not go down. She could still hear Cordelia's voice, that musical, poisonous lilt, carrying the length of the table and landing on her like a hand across the face. Sale price. Furniture. She could still see the faces of the dinner guests, the frozen forks, the averted eyes, the way Colonel Dane had stared at his plate as though he wished he could climb into it and disappear, and the way not one of them had said a single word in her defence. 8 families had sat at that table, and 8 families had heard Cordelia call her livestock, and not one of them had spoken. She pressed her hands over her face and breathed. The fury came next, slower and deeper than the shame, and it was worse because the fury had nowhere to go. She could not confront Cordelia without endangering the plan. She could not explain herself to the county families without revealing what she knew. She could not even weep properly because the tears felt like defeat, and Susan Hartley had spent 19 years refusing to let her father's failures turn her into someone who gave up. But the worst of it, the part that sat beneath the shame and the fury and would not be breathed away, was the recognition that Cordelia had not been wrong. Not entirely. Susan's father had sold her. The price had been £3,000. The transaction had been written on paper and signed and witnessed, and there was no interpretation of those facts that did not reduce her to something with a value that could be counted in coin. She had known this since the night her father signed the contract, but knowing it privately was one thing. Hearing it spoken aloud in a room full of strangers who would carry the words home in their carriages and repeat them over breakfast was another thing entirely, and the difference between the two was the difference between a wound and a scar. One of them was still bleeding. She sat on the floor for a long time. The candle on the nightstand burned down by a quarter before she heard the knock. It came soft and deliberate, 2 taps and then silence, and she knew who it was before she stood, because only one person in this house knocked like that, as though the door itself deserved courtesy. Arthur stood in the corridor without his cane. His eyes were clear and focused and carrying something that looked, in the low light, very much like anger, though it was not directed at her. The mask was gone entirely. "May I come in?" She let him in. He crossed to the window and stood there looking out at the dark grounds, his hands clasped behind his back, and for a long time neither of them spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who were both angry about the same thing, and did not yet trust themselves to speak about it without raising their voices. "I am sorry," he said at last, "for what she said to you tonight, and for the fact that I sat 3 feet from her and could not stop it without revealing everything we have built. I know. She is testing me, every day, the glass, the candles, the napkin. She needs to believe I am blind, or she will run before we are ready. I know that too." Arthur turned from the window. In the low candlelight his face was open in a way she had never seen it, not even in the library with Edmund's portrait, and Susan realized that what she was looking at was not the face behind the mask. It was the face beneath that, the one he kept even further down, and it was the face of a man who had been alone with an unbearable thing for so long that the act of speaking about it required a kind of courage that had nothing to do with bravery and everything to do with exhaustion. "I need to tell you about my brother," he said. He sat down in the chair by her desk, and he was quiet for a moment before he began, as though he were gathering the words from a place where they had been stored untouched for a very long time. "Edmund was the best of us. He was open-hearted and reckless and generous to a fault, and he had a way of walking into a room that made everyone in it feel as though they had been waiting for him without knowing it. He was 22 years old, and he had more friends than I will ever have, and he followed me to the meadow that morning, because he did not trust me to keep my head. Arthur's voice dropped lower, and he looked at his hands where they rested on his knees. He was right. I was angry and proud, and I had accepted a duel I should have walked away from. The quarrel was not worth a man's life. It was barely worth a raised voice. But I went, and Edmund came with me because that is what Edmund did. He stood behind people he loved and refused to leave. He paused. The fire shifted in the grate, and the shadows on the wall moved. When the shot came, it came from the wrong direction. I knew it instantly, the way you know when a sound is behind you instead of in front of you. Edmund knew it too. He turned toward me and I saw his face change, and then he stepped sideways and put himself between me and the tree line, and the ball took him in the chest. Arthur's hands were on his knees and they were trembling. He did not try to hide it, and he did not grip the fabric to make it stop. He let them shake, and Susan watched and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would be anything other than noise. He fell against me. I caught him under the arms and we went down together onto the grass, and I could feel the blood coming through his coat before I could see it. He looked up at me and said my name, just my name, nothing else, and his voice was surprised, as though he had not expected it to hurt as much as it did. And then he was quiet. The surgeon was 10 minutes away by horse. It took Edmund 2 minutes. I held him for the other 8 because I did not know what else to do, and by the time the surgeon arrived my hands were red to the wrists, and Edmund's eyes were open, and he was not looking at anything anymore. The room was very quiet. The candle on the nightstand flickered once and steadied. "He was 22, Arthur said again, and this time his voice cracked on the number, a small fracture that opened and closed in the space of a single breath. He had not yet married. He had not yet done half the things he talked about doing. He followed me to that meadow because he loved me, and I let him stand behind me, and Cordelia Vale put a pistol ball through his chest from 40 yards away, because he had found her forging documents, and she could not let him speak." He lifted his head and looked at Susan directly. "I have been pretending to be blind for 2 years, because the woman who murdered my brother is standing in my dining room testing my wine glass and rearranging my candlesticks and watching my face for any sign that I can see her. And if she sees that I can see, she will know I saw her behind that tree with the pistol in her hand, and she will disappear across the channel before the law can touch her, and Edmund will never have justice. I will have let him die for nothing. I will have failed him twice." His voice finished, but the weight of the words stayed in the room, filling the space between them, the way smoke fills a room after a fire has gone out. Susan did not speak immediately. She stood where she was and let the silence hold, because Arthur had carried this alone for 2 years, and the least she could do was let the telling of it have its own gravity before she answered. Then she crossed the room and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers with a grip that was not steady, not controlled, not the careful grip of a duke who managed every gesture for an audience. It was the grip of a man who had been carrying something too heavy for one person for too long, and who had finally found someone standing close enough to share the weight. "She will not run," Susan said. "We will not let her." Arthur leaned forward and pressed his forehead against her hand, and he stayed there, breathing, and Susan held on and did not move and did not let go, and the candle burned lower, and the house was silent around them. They planned through the night. The Carrickmore Autumn Assembly was in 10 days. Every family of consequence in the county would attend. Lady Cordelia would attend because she could not resist a stage, and Susan would be ready. She sat at her desk after Arthur left and wrote from memory, in her own hand, every detail of her father's suppressed duel report, every name, every time, every measurement. 12 paces, east-facing, the shot from the tree line, the powder burns, the angle of entry, the inconsistent range. She wrote until the candle burned out, and then she lit another and kept writing. The Carrickmore Assembly fell on the last Saturday of October. The great hall of Carrickmore House blazed with 500 candles and smelled of beeswax and chrysanthemums. 112 guests circulated beneath a vaulted ceiling, their voices a low, constant hum of gossip and greeting. The Ashworths were there, Colonel Dane, the Renshaw family, Lady Marguerite in midnight blue, seated near the front of the room with a glass of sherry and eyes that missed nothing. Nell, who had begged to come and stood near the doorway in her best dress, watching. Arthur entered on Susan's arm, his cane tapping the polished floor. The crowd parted. Conversations dipped and reformed in their wake. The blind Duke, and that girl he married. Lady Cordelia Vale stood near the centre of the room in emerald silk, surrounded by admirers. She saw Arthur enter and smiled the way a cat smiles at a closed cage. Susan felt the room's attention shift and settle. She felt the weight of every eye that had heard Cordelia's remark at the dinner. Furniture, sale price, the debtor's daughter. She straightened her spine and walked forward. Mr. Aldridge was already in the vestibule with 2 officers from the county constabulary. They had been there since 8 o'clock. Cordelia moved first. She crossed the room with the easy confidence of a woman who had already won. She took Arthur's arm as though Susan were not there, angling her body between them, and addressed the room. His Grace and I have a matter of long standing to settle. Her voice carried to every corner. She produced a folded document from her reticule and held it up for the Assembly's host, Lord Carrickmore, to see. A betrothal contract between our families, predating his current marriage by 3 years. As you can see, His Grace's signature is quite clear. Murmurs rippled through the hall. Heads turned. Lord Carrickmore took the document and frowned at it. Cordelia turned to Susan with a smile that was all teeth. "I am sorry, Your Grace, but a prior contract takes precedence. I am sure you understand." Every eye in the room turned to Susan. Susan stepped forward. Her hands were steady. Her voice, when she spoke, carried across the hall without effort, the way it had carried across her father's study for 6 years, the way it had carried across Arthur's drawing room for weeks. "That is not the Duke's signature." The murmurs stopped. 112 people held their breath. "The crossbar on the capital H is wrong. His Grace crosses left to right with a descending stroke. This signature crosses right to left with an ascending stroke. The tail on the Y curls backward. His Grace's does not. I have read 7 years of the Duke's correspondence, and I have read your letters to my father, Lady Cordelia. The handwriting on that contract is yours." Cordelia's smile did not waver. The little clerk plays at handwriting analysis. How very desperate. Susan did not flinch. She did not raise her voice. She continued. "On the 14th of September 2 years ago, a duel was fought at Ravenfield Meadow between Mr. James Whitlock and the then Mr. Arthur Crewe, on behalf of Lady Cordelia Vale. Edmund Crewe attended as second. The room was perfectly still. Not a glass clinked, not a shoe shifted. The shot that killed Edmund Crewe did not come from Mr. Whitlock's pistol. The powder burns on Edmund's coat were consistent with a range of 40 yards, not 12. The angle of entry was 30 degrees off the line of the duel. The shot came from the tree line to the east, from a position behind a birch tree approximately 40 yards from the duelling ground. Cordelia's smile was gone. My father, Gerald Hartley, magistrate of Thornbury, ruled the death of Edmund Crewe as death by misadventure. He sealed the report. He sealed it because the woman who held his gambling debts told him to seal it. Susan turned to face Cordelia directly. That woman is standing in this room. The silence was crystalline. Lady Ashworth's hand had risen to cover her mouth. Colonel Dane was on his feet. Lord Carrickmore held the forged betrothal contract in both hands, staring at it. Lady Marguerite set down her glass of sherry and folded her hands, and on her face was something that might have been satisfaction. Cordelia took a step backward. "This is absurd. The girl is hysterical. She is repeating her father's lies because she is afraid of losing her position." Arthur set down his cane. He released Susan's arm. He straightened to his full height. And he turned to Lady Cordelia Vale and looked her in the face. Not the wandering, unfocused gaze the world had seen for 2 years. Not the careful performance of blindness that had kept him alive. His eyes found Cordelia's with the same absolute precision with which they had found Susan's on their wedding night, and they held. "You killed my brother," he said. The room did not breathe. Cordelia stumbled. Her hand shot out behind her and caught the edge of a table. A glass tipped, rolled, and shattered on the floor. The sound was enormous in the silence. Lady Renton gasped. A young woman near the window pressed her fist against her mouth. Arthur picked up his cane. He held it out to Cordelia, as she had once taken it from him to test his blindness. She did not take it. She stared at his eyes, at the focus in them, at the 2 years of deception looking back at her, and her face went white as paper. Susan spoke the last line. "The constable is in the vestibule, Lady Cordelia. He has been there since 8 o'clock. Cordelia looked at the door. She looked back at Arthur. Her mouth opened, but no words came. Mr. Aldridge entered through the vestibule doors, followed by 2 county officers. The room parted for them in complete silence. 112 witnesses watched as Mr. Aldridge presented the officers with the forged contract, the Foreign Office dispatch, and Susan Hartley's handwritten reconstruction of the sealed duel report. Lady Cordelia Vale was escorted from the Carrickmore Assembly at 9:17 that evening. She did not speak. She did not resist. She walked between the 2 officers with her chin raised and her face the colour of ash, and the doors closed behind her. In the week that followed, the consequences landed like hammer blows, each one public and documented. The forged betrothal contract was entered into evidence at the county court. Gerald Hartley's sealed magistrate report was unsealed by order of the Lord Chancellor. Mr. James Whitlock, who had spent 2 years under suspicion of killing Edmund Crewe, was exonerated and his name formally restored. Gerald Hartley was stripped of his magistracy and removed from the bench. At Susan's request, he was permitted to retire to a cottage in Dorset rather than face debtor's prison. It was more mercy than he had earned, and they both knew it. Arthur stood before the assembly in the minutes after Cordelia's arrest. The room was still vibrating with the shock of it, and 100 faces stared at a man they had believed blind for 2 years. "My wife," he said, and his voice carried to every corner. "The Duchess of Ravenfield is the bravest woman I have ever known. Every word she has spoken tonight is the truth, and I see her perfectly." The silence held for 1 breath. 2. Then Colonel Dane began to clap, slow and deliberate, and the sound spread through the room like a wave breaking. Lady Ashworth was weeping openly. Lord Carrickmore bowed from the waist. Lady Marguerite lifted her glass of sherry in Susan's direction with an expression that said, quite clearly, that she had known all along and had been waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. Nell, standing by the door in her best dress, was crying and smiling at the same time. Susan stood in the centre of that noise and let it wash over her. She did not weep. She did not raise her voice. But she reached for Arthur's hand, and he took it, and for the first time in her life, Susan Hartley felt the ground beneath her feet hold steady. The carriage ride back to Ravenfield was dark and quiet. They sat across from each other, the lantern swinging gently on its hook, the road unspooling behind them. Arthur had left the cane on the floor of the carriage. He would not need it again. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Arthur leaned forward. He took Susan's hand, not the practised, too precise hand of a blind man, the deliberate hand of a man who could see her, and was choosing to reach. "I married you because I needed you," he said. "I am asking you now because I want you." "Asking me what?" "To stay, not for Cordelia, not for Edmund, not for evidence or justice or conspiracy." His voice was rough and quiet and stripped of every formal register he had ever used with her. "For me?" He knelt. In the carriage, in the dark, on the road back to Ravenfield, the Duke of Ravenfield knelt on the floor and looked up at his wife. Susan put her hand on his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw and the sharp edge of his cheek. He leaned into her palm and closed his eyes, and for the first time in 2 years, the darkness was voluntary. "You looked me in the eye on our wedding night," she said, "and told me the truth when every other person in my life had lied. I have been staying since then." He pressed his forehead to her hand and stayed there, and the carriage carried them home. 18 months later, Ravenfield was unrecognizable. The east wing and the west wing were no longer divided. The doors between them stood open, and light moved through the house in a way it had not done in years. Susan's desk sat in the library beside Arthur's, and their correspondence mingled on the surface, his estate letters stacked next to her legal notes. The staff had stopped whispering. Nell hummed while she worked. Mr. Holt, who had served 3 Dukes of Ravenfield and had never been seen to smile, had been seen to smile. In the garden, Arthur sat on a stone bench with a child in his arms. She was 7 months old, dark-haired like her father, with her mother's steady gaze. Arthur held her carefully, pointing out the sparrows in the hedgerow with a solemnity that made Susan, watching from the library window, press her hand against her chest where the feeling lived. Lady Marguerite arrived at noon, as she did every Thursday, with a basket of shortbread and opinions about the baby's wardrobe. She kissed the child, critiqued the garden, and sat down beside Arthur with the air of a woman who had been right about everything and intended to enjoy it. "She has your brother's mouth," Marguerite said, looking at the baby. Arthur's hand stilled on his daughter's back. Then he nodded. "She does." It was the first time Susan had heard him speak of Edmund, without grief collapsing his voice. The wound was still there, it would always be there. But it had settled into something he could carry without breaking, and the child in his arms was part of the reason. That afternoon a letter arrived from Mr. Aldridge. Susan opened it at her desk. The trial date for Lady Cordelia Vale had been set for the Michaelmas term. The Crown would require the Duchess of Ravenfield's testimony. Mr. Aldridge had also enclosed a secondary note, marked for Susan's eyes only. She read it twice. During the preparation of evidence for trial, a second signature had been found on the original arrangements for the duel at Ravenfield Meadow. Not Cordelia's, not Gerald Hartley's. Someone else had known about the plan before the shots were fired, someone who had not yet been named. Susan set the letter on the desk and looked through the window at her husband, sitting in the garden with their daughter, pointing at the birds. He looked up. Across the garden, through the glass, his eyes found hers the way they always did now, direct and clear and unwavering. Susan picked up her pen. There was more work to do. If you want to know who else knew about the duel before Edmund died, subscribe and stay close. That story is coming.